Hello, everybody. I'm Jon Atack, and I'm delighted to welcome my dear friend, Karen De La Carriere. Hi, Karen.
Greetings, married Jon.
Yes.
Jon, it was a lovely wedding. I just long journey to Northampton and then your town, but boy, what a joyous occasion. How smoothly it went. And
it's great.
People came from so many different countries to honor your special day and your vows. Pam is such a delight.
She is.
Just a delight.
Absolutely.
I love the way she wasn't sitting in some high chair. She was dishing out the ice cream like her server, mingling with them. She's just so, huh?
We even made all of the ice cream. So she and I made iced mousses from fruit, all picked from my own garden.
Oh my goodness. Now I regret not having it. I've got this, I watched my diet carefully. I thought, no, there's so many main courses of absolute gourmet food. The food was exquisite.
Wasn't it? The caterer was a company called Zest Catering. And I was tremendously impressed with the quality, restaurant quality food, really beautifully prepared. So yeah. And it was amazing. People, you kindly came all the way from Los Angeles, which is a few thousand miles, about 5,000 miles or something. And Hoyt also came over from LA. Steve came from Boston. Yuval came from Colorado. And there was.
And you had others from European countries.
We had Nashville and the environs of Washington, D.C. and a couple of Dutch friends came over. And there was a guy there from Australia, but who was part of Pamela's family, but he was in England anyway. But and somebody from Norway and somebody from Luxembourg. So it's a very cosmopolitan event.
It was, yeah. No, I ran into others from other countries who are not quite in Europe, because you have so many friends, Jon.
I do.
So
and it's very humbling that so many people were willing to travel so far to celebrate this. That was incredible.
Not to mention people who came from way all over England.
Yeah.
Like Bonnie came from Bristol, but there were people who came from northern, all kinds of.
South coast and down from the north. So
brought many people together. People had that linkage because of your wedding. It was just, and the ceremony was so good, and the Grange Hall was perfect. And oh boy, I like your eldest son, Ben.
Yeah,
he's impressive.
Yeah.
Ooh, we have a future politician.
I think he'll probably be prime minister, if not world emperor at some point. Yeah.
I believe you. I absolutely believe you. Yeah. Geez, your boys are great. Ben is just truly impressive. I meet a lot of people, Jon, just constantly, and because I'm plugged into many animal rescue groups and all kinds of activities, but Ben stood out. You must be very proud of him.
I am very proud of him.
I just want to thank you because I made these, the pandemic and just one last thing. People made all this hullabaloo of how Heathrow was a nightmare and 4 hours to wait for luggage, blah, blah, blah. Well, let me tell you, I arrived at Heathrow. I got my luggage in 15 minutes flat. And I was through customs and immigration in no time at all. Came back to Los Angeles, British Airways, got my luggage in 13 minutes. And I have global entries, so I go through a high-speed line. I did feel sorry after a 10-hour flight for people in a queue that didn't have high-speed global entry. Global entry trusted traveler is a card the government issue you when they've done a background check on you to be sure you're not a terrorist or have any criminal record or arrest record. And boom, I was through. So Jeffrey says from the time he arrived at LAX to pick me up, I was through the line and out of Los Angeles airport in 45 minutes, including luggage, including immigration, including everything. I tell you, the media get it wrong sometimes. The media are still saying, what are the airlines? And either your wedding had an incredible karma around it, but travel was no problem at all, none.
Well, I think everybody in the audience should know that being a suppressive person has advantages, and you know, and it is a crazy thing, isn't it? I was thinking about this before. A friend of mine, when he left Scientology many years ago, nearly 40 years ago, he said that he'd done a simple calculation after 12 or 15 years in Scientology, and that is that the product of pro-social people would be friends, and the product of antisocial people would be enemies. And when he looked at Scientology, he realized that it had just created so much enmity, so much hostility. Maintain friendly relations with the public and the environment, the senior policy of Scientology. And it's a nonsense. They antagonize people. And so these many years afterwards, nearly 40 years now, it'll be 39 years in October since I left, that here I am, that you're not struck down by a bolt of lightning when you leave. And I am surrounded not by cowed and ill associates, people like L. Ron Hubbard, that is, but by people who are able to travel around the world in quite healthy fashion, and so that there is definitely life after Scientology. I'd just like to let that be broadly known.
Beautiful, beautiful. And unlike David Miscavige and Hubbard, you're not in hiding.
No.
Miscavige is a fugitive. He doesn't want to be served, so he's in hiding. He's dressed as secret. You're not in hiding.
Nope.
And if only a spy from OSA could have been in Grange Hall. Your numerous friends that just kept arriving and arriving, no matter what the cult did to try and badmouth Black PR, you have a gigantic amount of friends who are willing to travel hundreds of miles, thousands of miles away, just to honor you on your special day, your wedding. Mm-hmm. It's a triumph, Jon. All their rah-rah is hogwash, meaningless, lies.
I was told by the head of the Office of Special Affairs Investigation Department in the United Kingdom in 1990.
Graham Wilson?
No. I'm not naming any names. In 1993, when she defected, after a conversation with me, that she had had a problem running agents against me. She had 18 months of running people against me. And that by this time, there were 4 people who were relatively close to me who were spying on me, because I wouldn't turn anybody away. And she said that one of the problems was that after a while, one of these agents would come to her and say, I can't do this anymore. He's too nice. So much for the suppressive person, Crazy stuff. And I mean, Richard DeMille, who wrote Science of Survival and How to Live There, an executive for Hubbard, he wrote to me after Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky was published. By this time, he was an emeritus professor, I think University of California, professor of psychology. And he wrote to me and he said that you've written the best book about Scientology. And he said, I've read them all, which I thought was very gratifying. But the one thing that you do point out is that the real suppressive person is Ron Hubbard. And it's just that easy. He was ill all of the time. He had a furious, vile temper. He was a bully. He was a sadist. And somehow he enchanted us and put us under his spell. But he did no good in the world. He harmed a tremendous, hundreds of thousands of people, probably in the long run. You look at all of the families and friends of people. So, he couldn't have a public wedding because, as you say, there'd be 300 Ritz servers waiting to, deliver process to him.
Yeah.
So, yeah, let's move on. You want?
So talking about lies, the lies and propaganda against you, I want to thank you for hooking me up with Bonnie Woods, who got them to admit they prattled out a tissue of lies. It's very rare to get the cult of Scientology to fall on their sword and admit they lied, that the propaganda they put out was lies, false, fake, bogus, hot air, nonsense, manufactured nonsense.
Yep.
Now, you played a huge part in this behind, so give me a little overview. You said Bonnie used to work for you. What kind of work did she do?
Well, Bonnie came to me in October 1991. Her recollection is 1992, but I'm relatively sure of this. I was about to do my third formal intervention with the Scientologists. I'd already talked to hundreds of Scientologists who were uncertain of their position, but I was about to do it, and the person who was going to come with me, who I'd better not name publicly, wrote me a letter to say that he couldn't come and help me. And this was a week before it was due to happen. And Bonnie had just come to see me, and she basically, I think she said she'd had 8 years of wandering around in a fog after she'd left Scientology. She'd done OT3, she'd worked in the Sea organization in Los Angeles. I think she was on and Bonnie can watch this and comment. My recollection is that she was taking a master's degree in psychology when she was recruited. She, in some of the talks that we've recorded and put on the channel here, she talks about her close relationship with Quentin Hubbard, the wonderful young man who committed suicide rather than carrying on with Scientology. And so she was highly involved, and it just pulled her mind apart. You know, she said she would walk up and down the beach all day, desperately trying to work out what was going on. And then she read Russell Miller's Barefaced Messiah, and the penny dropped that maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was something to do with Scientology. And she found that he referenced me as the expert on Scientology. So she then got hold of Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky in its original edition, and called me up and came to see me. And you know her, she's just the most delightful human being. And she said, was there anything that she could do to help? And so, because I'd had this letter, and just to make this clear, the guy who'd written me the letter lived a 5-minute walk away from me. So, you know, he was backing out of this thing, and which I can understand. It can be difficult. So we went down to Eastbourne, and I'd been approached by a 21-year-old German woman who wanted to get her friend out, who was also 21 and from East Germany, in fact. And we rocked up to Eastbourne, and for a couple of days talked with this young woman, and she was not convinced. You know, when I showed her the fair game law and this kind of thing, she was, yeah, well, you have to do these things to suppress it. You know, it's like, okay. And so we drove back to East Grinstead. And when we got to East Grinstead, we realized we'd been followed. And I'd already gone into my house, and Bonnie summoned me out. And there was a guy with a video camera. And I'm afraid I lost my temper a little with him, and got him to stop filming. They use a photograph of me that makes me look like a howler monkey. I don't know if they processed it at all, but I'm pretty sure it's from that camera on that day, because I was annoyed. And I'm usually a fairly peaceful and tolerant person, but seeing people on either side of the street, and they've been following us. And the wonderful thing was that absolutely convinced this young woman to leave Scientology. If that hadn't happened, she might have stayed in.
Oh.
And there was a backstory to that. Her mother had got her into Scientology and then committed suicide. Scientologist. And I'd just like to make a little footnote here. I did a study a couple of years after that in 1993. I studied, I think it was 38 cases of suicide that I gathered. And by comparing the actual membership of Scientology, which might have been about 40,000 at that time, it's probably around 20,000 now, it's diminishing rapidly. Comparing the actual membership to the amount of suicides, the suicide rate in Scientology was about 10 times the national average in the United Kingdom. So very high. You know, if you were talking about double, you'd already be talking about, you know, a very high amount. But anyway, this young woman's mother had committed suicide and left a manuscript behind, which I've never seen, and I don't read German anyway, but apparently describing these events. So that's how I came to meet Bonnie, and we were thrown together very quickly. Her husband, Richard, then came out on future interventions to make sure that we had a bodyguard in case Scientology interfered again. And we did a few more interventions together. I withdrew from that work in 1995. It was simply too stressful. And she didn't really carry on with interventions, but she and Richard carried on talking to Scientologists. I was asked to work with a group called Christians Together in East Grinstead, which was run by the absolutely wonderful Anglican canon, Roger. And it was a little bit of a misnomer because the Catholic priest wouldn't be in the same room with the Baptists. So they weren't really Christians together, they were Christians untogether. The Baptists were quite happy to be in the same room as the Catholic priest, but they did understand that he was an agent of the devil, you know, so religion's interesting stuff. So for about 2 years, I actually worked with them on various projects, largely with Bonnie's help, to construct a kind of underground railroad so that people were being shipped in from Zimbabwe, from the Baltic states. They'd send a mission out there. They'd tell people we're a religious organization, they have a wonderful life, everything will be paid for, you'll get a free education. There's a guy from Ethiopia called Musi Hailu who came to me. And he said, you know, they told me they're a Christian organization. I'm a Christian. And I get there and I find out they've got nothing to do with Christianity. And of course, they had my passport and I couldn't afford a plane ticket back to Ethiopia. I had no money. And had a guy who trained pilots who came from Estonia. And the same thing had happened to him. I had 5 guys from Zimbabwe. What we started doing was putting up, we knew that on a Saturday morning, if any of them got the morning off, that one morning a week, they might get off if their statistics were good, that they would be allowed into East Grinstead on Saturday morning. And so we started putting posters up in the native language of these people. And it worked a treat, you know. So the Christian families would house them. They'd help to pay their airfare home, or quite often, certainly with people from Zimbabwe, they wanted to stay here. They didn't want to go back to Zimbabwe, which I can absolutely understand at that time under Mugabe. And Bonnie and I were very much involved with that. I published a little booklet called The Total Freedom Trap around that time, which has been superseded by this little booklet, Scientology, The Cult of Greed, which is really for people who've not had any involvement with Scientology. And it's pretty hard hitting. When we first met in London, I gave you a copy of it, I remember. And you commented kindly upon it. Then, Bonnie, we had this thing where Scientology had opened the Dianetic bookstore in East Grinstead. And for those who don't know, St. Hill Manor, where Hubbard lived from 1959 to 1965, so was the headquarters of Scientology. St. Hill Manor is actually 4 miles outside of East Grinstead. Scientology had never actually run any premises in East Grinstead and has a dreadful reputation in the town there. I think declaring 25 of the local businesses suppressive and subjecting them to fair game was not a very good way of maintaining friendly relations with the public and the environment. I mean, there's a lawyer called Mason and Beer, and when I first went to them and talked to them, they still remembered, 20 years later, that they'd been declared suppressive. And so there's a terrible feeling. It's a very drab, awful town. Last time I went to it, it's as if there's a cloud of fear that hangs over it because of the attempts of Scientology to take over. So they established the Dianetic bookstore, and they were treated very badly. I'm ashamed to say that somebody actually firebombed the bookstore, which is really not the way to deal with problems. Hate is not the answer. But at the same time, they opened a mission in Chichester, and I was talking with an Anglican vicar there, and it was put to me, is there something we could do? Could Christians together in East Grinstead, or could this people in Chichester do something? So I said, well, yes, let me write a little leaflet. And leaflet started 75 million years ago. An evil galactic prince called Xenu rounded up the population of, 176 planets? I can't remember anymore off the top of my head, and brought them to Earth and exploded them in volcanoes. This sounds like the product of a science fiction writer, and it is.
No, I've lost you there. This was a leaflet.
Leaflet
by Bonnie and Richard?
Well, this is what they were sued for. This is how the litigation started, that I said, well, just find 2 local Christians and there will be a body router, or body router, if you prefer the American pronunciation, who is coming out of the Dianetic bookstore or the Chichester mission. Find that person, go up to them, 2 of you, always 2 of you, and say, hi, we're going to spend the day with you, and everybody you approach, we're going to give this leaflet to. Here's one for you. And sure enough, they'd go back in. Now, we closed the Dianetic bookstore in Chichester mission within 2 months. I'm amazed that nobody picked this tactic up anywhere else in the world. When Anonymous were doing all of their stuff, if they picketed the businesses of Scientologists rather than Scientology orgs and said, this business gives its money to Scientology, then I think they'd have got more of a reaction than they did. But, it allowed people to vent a lot of their frustration, which may have been good. Personally, I don't think picketing the organizations is valuable, because I want to help the people in the organizations, not insult and attack them so they feel justified in their feelings. So anyway, Bonnie and Richard were sued for the contents of this leaflet. For some reason, Scientology, despite its remarkable intelligence capabilities, never worked out that I'd written it. So they didn't sue me. And as the case is completely settled, I don't think they will now. The case was awful. The amount of pressure, that Bonnie was put under, and the amount of suffering and trauma that it caused her as the years went by, what the legal process is.
Apparently, Beverly, her original lawyer, was she intimidated with fagging because she quit?
Beverly Ryle.
Yeah.
Beverly Ryle. There were a number of things that happened. She was in Chichester. Her children kept a pet rabbit, fancy sort of rabbit in the back garden. The rabbit was killed. Pet killing being a standard operation. Yeah. Judge Ritchie suffered.
The cult of Scientology kills pets. There's story after story after story.
Yeah, it's, anything to try and destabilize you, anything to try and undermine you and, turn you into a nervous wreck. I suffered 16 years of this, and during that time I did not keep any pets. But it was daily for a long time, just to intimidate you, to make you kind of realize, and it is a sensible realization, that you should probably do something else with your life. But I'm a very stubborn person, so the more they kept coming, the more I kept responding. I wonder why sometimes, I must say, because other things I might have done with my life. It certainly wasn't financially rewarding. And while it was often said that the CIA were backing all of these efforts against Scientology, I'm afraid I never met one of them. And they certainly never put anything to my bank account. But so the case basically was a case for libel. It was saying that Bonnie and Richard, and so Bonnie and Richard countersued, and ultimately it led to, as I thought it would. I constructed the case. A company called Allen and Overy in London, who are one of the high-flying legal firms in the world, they every year would take on a pro bono case where they work for free. And in fact, one of my brothers was so impressed by the work, and he's a high-flying businessman, by the work that this company did, that he asked to know what their fees were. And at the time, the lawyer who headed the case was charging £420 an hour. So beyond my reach, you know. Which is what, about $650 an hour, and we're winding back here into the 1990s. This is some time ago. They basically came to me to design the case, and the design of the case is very straightforward. If you're up against Scientology, you put material in that they don't want to see in public.
Yeah, that is key. Let's repeat that now.
Yeah, you put material.
That's brilliant.
Material in that they don't want the public to know about.
Right, and their secret holy grail secret about secrets is that you are infested. You are not a single soul in a body, for those that even believe there's a spirit in a body, but you are gazillions of attached, what they call clusters, all jammed together, fused together. And their birth certificate for 75 million years ago, when volcanoes exploded on Earth, and these souls, a soul is pure thought if they don't have a body, yet they were packaged in frozen glycol and dropped with hydrogen bombs on volcanoes. This is their secret, which you pay about 30,000, 40,000 to get to.
I think it's probably a lot more than that now. I think you're probably looking at a couple of 100,000 to get through.
They dropped prices, John, because things have been so slow because of the pandemic. There's package deals, but what you do once you're grooved in on this is you go and telepathically talk to these souls who were frozen in glycol and dropped in, and you send them telepathically to 75 million years ago. And you make them run through the entire thing, plus a Cecil B. DeMille movie of 33 days. Hubbard likens it to a Cecil B. DeMille movie. 33
well, he had worked with Cecil B. DeMille's son, Richard.
Yes,
totally. Direct influence there.
Yeah. So run all this, but you do the work.
Until the pilot says you're mocking it up.
You're mocking it.
It's absolute madness. There's a deconstruction that my friend Peter Ford made of operating Thetan level 3 many years ago, back in the 80s. Peter just sat down and said, well, let's look at the geology of this. And of course, the two places where these volcanoes were meant to exist actually erupted 9 million years ago. The Canary Islands and Hawaii. So there were no volcanoes there. If we just get to symbol, I'm pretty sure that Hubbard, because the early dates for the last great extinction, the extinction of the dinosaurs, originally it was being said were about 75 million years ago. We now know it was 65 million. So, you know, if you don't have the right date and you don't have the right location, then it's just, and you never evaluate for the pre-clear. You don't tell people what, just round and round and round. There's no sense. I've so often talked about interviewing Virginia Downsborough, who rescued Hubbard from Las Palmas when he was working on OT3. And she said he was crazy, which is why she turned down his offer to be the founding member of the Sea Project, the Sea Organization, because he was out of his mind. And she said, you know, he was living on a shelf full of drugs. He wasn't eating, he wasn't sleeping, and he was terrified that the body thetans would take him over. He was demented. He was crazy. He was taking Demerol, which is an opiate. He was doubtless taking amphetamines, barbiturates, and mixing them all up and getting himself into this dreadful state, out of which he delivered the technology of OT3. But in terms of going to court cases, yes, we used to put the OT3 pack, the OT4 pack, the OT5 pack into court, but we would also ask for the OT8 pack, so, and they'd get stuck in this place where they don't want to give the documents. I'm afraid that in litigating against Scientology, people are very naive. I've worked in all on about 150 cases, and we won every case where I was not a named party. But when they came up against me, they used a tactic which 6 months after they'd eaten me alive, we never went to trial. There was always just a pre-trial motion, another pre-trial motion, and they managed to hoodwink the judges. In fact, the law changed 6 months after they'd finished me off, so they wouldn't have been able to do it. They'd used a loophole that was to do with the production of documents, whereby you had to produce every possible copy you had that showed a certain piece of information. And Lord Justice Wolfe closed that loophole and said, it's the information that's relevant, not having all 15 of the documents that say the same thing. So, I was unlucky, but I devised a tactic to deal with them, which worked for Bonnie Woods. It worked for Mary Johnson in Ireland, who inherited those documents. To some extent, I was involved with the Lawrence Wallersheim case. Lawrence got $9.2 million. They marched up and down outside the courtroom chanting, "Not one thin dime for Wallersheim," but they paid him $9.2 million. And of course, they were battling against Jerry Armstrong. I think Jerry had 48 cases brought against him. Paulette Cooper had seen this sort of thing. And you need the resources if you're going to deal with them. You need a law firm that's not going to be frightened off. And you need to understand, Lawrence spent 20 years getting that judgment. It should be a lot easier now, but you don't approach it as a normal court case. You approach it knowing that they will delay as much as possible.
Yes.
Lord Justice Wolfe, in fact, commented that it was the case in English justice that he with the deepest pockets wins. And, that can be the case. So you need substantial backing. I think the prospect should be class actions where people come together and say, these same things were done to us. We were trafficked as slaves. I think that is the essential cause at the moment. We were abused. Control of our own lives was taken away from us. And we were not given what was promised to us. I did work on a case called Freedom for All in Religion, which was centered in Los Angeles. I think there were more than 400 people in the class action. This was in 1988. And when I arrived in Los Angeles, I met with Hannah and Jerry Whitfield, who were working on the case. Valerie and Manfred Stansfield, and another couple. There were 6 people on the steering committee. And I met with the lawyers, and the lawyers said, we've put the complaint in 4 times, and the judge has said you have to rewrite it. You haven't proved that you're a class, and you haven't proved that the people you're suing are a class. So I sat with the lawyers, and they were very relieved. They said, we haven't really understood what this was about. Thank you for explaining it to us. And I was able to show that, that the corporate veil, pierce the corporate veil, show that there was a corporate monolith, that Scientology was absolutely controlled by David Miscavige, who had undated signed resignations for all of the many corporations. I linked corporations together. The work I did was used by Ben Corridon in his case to reclaim his building in Riverside. He still hasn't paid his bill, by the way. If anybody out there knows Bent, it's now 30 years. And he got a $2 million building, and he hasn't paid me the bill, let alone 30 years worth of interest on it. No. And I'm not happy about that, Bent. I'm really not happy about that. But it was also used in the Wallersheim case. I worked on David Mayo's cases. I worked on all sorts of cases. And in all, we took $14 million in damages and payments. of which I received very, very little, because I had this noble idea that you should work for free. And so I was borrowing money so I could help these people do this. So if anybody would like to make a donation to me, it's probably a bit late, but it would be most welcome. But the tactic, you had to be looking at how they fight. And without understanding
where
that,
I want to, with your wisdom, with all your experience in litigation, see if you can tell me 1, 2, 3 basic fundamental. Well, engaging someone like Bonnie Woods or you, there's nothing like getting someone who was in the trenches, who worked, they know the tactics, know the delay tactics, know the frivolous little motions filed, forcing you into more to counters, to respond and all of. But what would you say if you had to just educate as a titillating little knowledgeable pearls of wisdom, throw out 1, 2, 3. What do potential litigants have to know before they launch into litigation with the cult of Scientology? 1, 2, 3. How would you name those 3 top first things first, the most prioritized things?
Be willing for every detail of your life to be made public. If you're not willing for that to happen, then there will come a point where you are blackmailed. I personally believe this is what happened to Marty Rathbun. There'll be a double offer. One part of it will be that they will pay you a monthly stipend. I was one of the first people this was offered to in 1994. I had an offer from Greg Ryerson, working for Scientology. I have a tape recording of it if anybody is interested, the conversation. And he said that they would find a gallery owner who would buy paintings from me. I'm an artist, fundamentally. That's my training and how I made my living before I suddenly became an expert on Scientology, which I'd never intended to do. So they'll offer you a monthly stipend rather than making a massive payment like the $5 million that they handed over to Michael Flynn to settle 25 cases of his. Because various people, Bill Franks, for example, made the silence contract public, and bless him for that. Jerry Armstrong, after he'd given away most of the money, decided it was his constitutional right to continue speaking. He found that was not true, and had to flee to Canada to preserve his liberty. So the first thing is, think about what they know about you, but think about anything you've done that you don't want to be public. And if you are willing to go ahead from that point, the second thing is to show that all of these corporations are part of, and these individuals are part of, one great conspiracy. Because if you don't, then parts will be lost from that. If you're taking a class action, you have to have a central cause. That, as I say, and I personally think that modern slavery is human trafficking is at the center now. It's the common action of Scientology. You have to pull together documents, evidence, witnesses, and you have to beware the paper mountain. Scientology's tactic is the paper mountain. They will keep sending in new requests for documents, new requests for hearings on the most trivial of matters. And you have to keep to the point with any judge that you deal with to say, this is a vicious and corrupt organization. It is engaged in a strategic lawsuit against public participation, to use the term that's used in the United States. I was actually privy to the beginning of the slap suits. Wallersheim won one of the very first ones against one of the frivolous lawsuits brought against him. And this is a procedure where if you can show that your opponent has a great deal more in terms of resources than you do, that you can go in for a one-day hearing to have a case dismissed, and you can actually be paid damages as a consequence of that. I think the first slap suit the woman won was awarded $70 million because it was punitive and the corporation was huge and it had to hurt them. And so bless her, she did quite well. But you have to go for expedition, which is to say justice should be fast, and you have to keep going to the judge and saying, these people are trying to slow things down. Let's have a hearing. Let's talk about this. Let's get to the meat of it. Don't go off and try and fight every detail. Keep everything to your central cause and go after that and keep presenting that. And be ready for it to take years, because it will go through each level of the justice system, right through to the Supreme Court of the United States in the US if they can, or Supreme Court here if they can, or even the European Court. They will try and do this by making it very clear and keeping it simple, that quote Ron Hubbard, the law can be used very easily to harass. In fact, actually, this little booklet here should be quite useful if you want to sue them, because it has all of the primary documents. And, you even get a print of L. Ron Hubbard's request for psychiatric treatment in 1947. You get a nice picture of Aleister Crowley as well. Have a good understanding of Scientology itself and what it's done in the past. And always keep coming back to saying Scientology is a single corporation with a dictator called David Miscavige who runs everything. Don't let them deviate from that idea. And
put David Miscavige in the lawsuit. Name him as an interested.
Yes, you should name him. You should always name him as a party, and you should always seek service of documents upon him and indeed all of the executives of Scientology, because once they're put into deposition or put on the witness stand, they're in a very difficult situation. Be very careful to look for contradictions, because once a judge sees that the witness has perjured themselves, then that witness will no longer have any value. And just the disreputable nature of Scientology is enough for many judges to pause and consider what is ethical and proper in the situation, what to do.
I'm waiting for you to say, bring in the OT levels.
Yes, in discovery, you should bring in the OT levels, bring in the ones that you have and demand OT8 and demand the lists, list 10, 11, and 12. If you have anybody who's done one of these. It's also good to have witnesses such as yourself who have profound experience of the organization, and their plaint will always be, we've changed since then. We've thrown the bad people like Karen De La Carriere out now, so we're a really good organization now. It's easy to show that excuse has been used perennially. David Gaiman used to use it, started using it in about 1965. We've got rid of the bad eggs. And then the Guardian's office had gone, we've got rid of the bad eggs. But they kept employing people like Miles Mellor and Peter Stumkey, who were actually doing the harassment. They kept on doing it, where there was this putting a head on a pike, as L. Ron Hubbard put it. So they pretended to reform. But in fact, the other thing that you always put into discovery is the information full hat. The information full hat, which I put on the internet in 1996, I think it was, somewhere around the time that I retired for the first time, is an 800-page pack training people in breaking and entering, how to lie, basically how to cheat and destroy your opponents. It's also necessary to look at government reports, because of course these, from a court's point of view, the government report from the UK government is a very valid document. And Sir John Foster's report of 1971 is again primary reading material for anybody that wants to sue Scientology, because he was able to round up some of the worst material and make it available. And because it's a government report, it's has the equivalent of a sworn statement, Sir John Foster was a member of Parliament and a Queen's Counsel, a barrister, the highest rank of barrister that we have, the highest rank of lawyer.
I got to tell you a little background story about John Foster you'll be surprised at. I had I was involved in a 3-year long-term relationship with a parliamentary consultant called Christopher Powell. And in one of their hate videos on me, they found pictures of him and they talked about, now this was a 3-year relationship. And they pumped it up that I was a mistress for hire. This is a 3-year solid relationship, not a one-night stand or anything like that. But the Guardian office used me to get Christopher Powell to find out if John Foster's report was favorable or very negative. And so I was used as the spy.
Mm.
And I talked to Christopher Powell extensively. And Christopher Powell said, well, it's got good and bad. It's not a total negative blast. And I reported that back to the GO. This is 1971, shows how long I've been in.
Mm.
I was a briefing course student at St. Hill at the time. And I was the first person on earth to whistleblow that the John Foster report was not a bleak slander. Isn't that interesting how?
And the reality is that the Foster report completely condemns Scientology. That's what actually happened. And he made some very interesting recommendations. He certainly felt that Scientology should never be given charitable status. But it's interesting that, you know, this sort of Matahari role that you had. I've interviewed, I can think of 2 women, one of whom had a relationship with a member of parliament on behalf of the Guardian's office to find out information. The other of whom was a volunteer to the Liberal MP Clement Freud. And I think she was working in his office for 4 years, leaking parliamentary material to the Guardian's office. I also was able to find the names of 2 people who had infiltrated the British Home Office, which is the Ministry for the Interior here. And to my interest, when I reported this to the Home Office, I received no reply. I found the actual names and the names they'd used. So at the same time, US government, French government, the Greek government, the Italian government, the Spanish government, the Canadian government were being infiltrated. So was the British government. But they had some kind of influence that prevented anything happening to that.
How is any of this religious? All this infiltration into governments, and you know, there's a lot of spy activity in this. And Scientology is so compartmentalized that the rank and file know nothing of all of this.
No, and you know, I had somebody questioning me on the channel here and saying, you know, I don't believe this. You know, this is like Germans who say that during World War II they knew nothing about the Holocaust. And honestly, as a public Scientologist, I didn't have the faintest idea about what happened on the Rehabilitation Project Force, about rice and beans diets, about the infiltration of government agencies, you know, that caused one head of station in the US to say that Scientology had the equivalent of the intelligence agency of a country. That, you know, I mean, it's been overblown. Lawrence Wright, I think, talks about there being 5,000 people, agents being placed. It's more like 50, but nonetheless, it was a significant and highly effective system of infiltration. And it has that sinister side to it. They were looking for blackmail material. And given the nature of corruption, unfortunately, in human society, there are many things that you can achieve by doing that. You know, when the district attorney in Florida was asked by a friend of his who spoke to me why it was the Lisa McPherson case hadn't been fully investigated, he said, I don't want anybody counting how many Scotch bottles there are in my trash. Not a good enough reason.
It might turn off people to be way too scared to sue the cult, like, oh, they're going to, you know, their word is so full of lies and propaganda that somehow they're blown up to be this huge, big Goliath. There's a house of cards there.
Oh.
And there are vulnerable points, because in Bonnie Woods, as you well know, with all your great coaching and all of this, not only did they fall on their sword and humbly apologize, but Alan and Overy got them to say they would never sue Bonnie on it. They wouldn't go after any hate campaign or nail her for all these issues ever again.
It's why Richard Woods is my publisher. Because yes, they have this peculiar undertaking that, and the same thing happened in the case against Ron Lawley and Robin Scott for their, you know, theft of OT materials in Copenhagen. I worked on that case for 10 years, and again, I'd like to say I wasn't paid. I ended up being owed £37,500 by Robin Scott and Ron Lawley, and I was paid 200 out of a fund that was gathered. And in fact, I went bankrupt as a consequence of that not being paid. But for 10 years, I worked on the case. I put the case together for them. And the idea was that they wouldn't go into court. And that's what happened. On the first day, I'd stayed up all night writing the questions for Ron Lawley to ask. I think Sheila Chalef was the first person on the stand. And he went to court and they dropped the case after 10 years. And the same happened with Bonnie Woods, that when the day of trial finally arrived and they couldn't put it off anymore, they dropped the case, they apologized in open court, and then had the temerity to tell the press that it was because they were sorry for Bonnie and all of the stress it had put on her. But they'd actually had to eat crow and admit that they had libeled her, and that, you know, that her statement against them, the piece that I wrote, was not libelous. They also paid her £55,000 to
that money of 1990. What year was that? That they?
It was around about 99. It was somewhere in the late 90s.
1999. £55,000 in 1990, and we're in 2022. That is huge money these days.
Yeah,
way more than.
And so the point is, yes, be aware that they are very unpleasant. Make sure that you're in a strong position. Make sure that your lawyers understand what you're dealing with. But there's safety in numbers. Seek to create a class action. Find other people to whom this has happened. And as you say, there's a house of cards with the proper action. And
be lucky and get a worldwide Top Gun law firm to represent you pro bono. If your case has got enough sexual abuse and enough outrageous conduct, there could be a top law firm that would take you on.
Look to the big law firms and present your case succinctly within a page and say, this is what happened. If we look back to Michael Flynn, the reason, and Michael Flynn was so important in the history of Scientology. So he's a top Boston lawyer. And one day a woman called Lavender Van Shake comes to him and says, I can't find a lawyer. I keep going to lawyers and nobody will represent me. Because what happens is, as soon as somebody takes me on, they get a letter and it says, I've had, I think it was 5 abortions and all of these sordid personal details, which are private and should not be. And, you know, the lawyer then drops me. And Michael Flynn said, I'm not interested. 3 days later, he got the letter. And he said, okay, you want a lawyer like that? You want a lawyer who is outraged by this treatment and a firm that's big enough not to be frightened of Scientology. So an international firm like Allen and Overy, you know, is a good place to go. And very often the big firms, and quite normally, the big firms will take on pro bono cases for the good, for which they won't charge. You can also, of course, have a contingency agreement whereby the law firm will take 50% of what you take, you know, what you make in the case. that's also worth looking at. But there's strength in numbers, and making sure that you have an action. And I think anybody who's been in the Sea Organization has a relevant action. Certainly if you've been moved from one country to another, the way that Mike Rinder was, where, at age 18, he's shipped from Australia thinking he's going to be trained and sent back to Australia. He gets to Hubbard's ship and is told, no, you're staying here. You work for us now. And his passport was gone. He had no funds to get home. And decades went by. And we can actually, just so that everybody knows, we can look forward to Mike's book coming out.
Yeah, next, in a matter of September. Well, we're in the first week of August, just 30 days away or so. Yeah, wow. I hope it's going to be a doozy.
Oh, it is. It is. Yeah, definitely.
Jon, you've given some really, really good insights. Just really, really good insights. You've got all the knowledge in the world there. And I hope that people looking at litigation, but you've got to get paid. You're just being too loosey-goosey here.
Well, I'm pretty much retired. I mean, if somebody comes to me, I may or may not talk to them. The only cases I've taken on are privately and without fee in the past have been cases that involve children.
Yeah.
But I'm 67 years old now. I have just about enough to live on. I'm very happily married, and I want to return to the career I put aside. I have more novels to publish. I have paintings to make. If I can help somebody, then that's fine. But my life is no longer centered on.
You don't want the battle and the warfare. Understand?
16 years was enough,
Yeah, yeah. You pass the torch, and others. Well, Bonnie's ready, willing, and able to coach anyone getting into litigation.
Yeah.
So, Jon, I have one final request.
Yeah. Can you, in a year or two, reaffirm your vows and do another thing and invite me again? Because I want to come back to repeat this glory. I want to have this incredible experience over again. You know how people reaffirm their vow, but that's usually after 20 years, 25 years. But go ahead and have another way and invite me again. I'll fly over anytime. It was so many people afterwards have come back to me and said what a wonderful thing it was. A friend of mine who too, who is 76 and had given up on the idea of love, said he might actually, maybe there's chance to do that again. So, and one of Pamela's relatives, who is known to be somewhat cynical, said, wow, what an incredible event, and my friend Hoyt Richard was saying he and his girlfriend are still talking about, how evident it was, the love that Pamela and I feel for each other. So there can be happy endings, Yeah. Great.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Jon,
thanks so much,
it
Karen.
was lovely.
Yeah.
Lots of wisdom. Thank you, Jon.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, Jon here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.